I think this is where the conversation becomes even more interesting, because once we begin to question the nature of reality itself, we are forced to examine one of the deepest assumptions we have ever made, that what we perceive is the complete picture. For centuries, we believed that reality existed independently of us, fixed and objective, waiting to be observed. Yet modern discoveries have challenged that certainty. The deeper researchers look into the foundations of matter, energy, and consciousness, the more they encounter a universe that behaves in ways that defy common sense. What fascinates me is not simply that reality appears strange. It is that our participation seems to matter more than we once imagined. Think about the experience of color. We often assume that colors exist out there in the world, but in truth, what we call color is the brain's interpretation of specific wavelengths of light. The redness of a rose is not contained inside the flower itself. It emerges through a relationship between the external world and our perception. This may seem like a simple observation, but its implications are profound. If something as familiar as color depends upon interpretation, how much of our everyday reality is also shaped through processes occurring within us? I believe this question opens a doorway to understanding the remarkable connection between consciousness and experience. Our brains continuously filter enormous amounts of information. Every second, countless sensory signals compete for attention, yet only a tiny fraction reaches conscious awareness. In many ways, our perception functions less like a camera and more like a translator, converting vast streams of data into a manageable story about the world. The story feels real because it is useful. But usefulness and completeness are not necessarily the same thing. Ancient traditions recognized this distinction long before modern neuroscience emerged. Across cultures, observers noticed that human beings often mistake their interpretation of reality for reality itself. Today's scientific research is revealing similar insights through entirely different methods. What we experience may be less like viewing a finished picture and more like participating in an ongoing process of creation. This becomes especially important when we consider the role of belief. Many people hear the word belief and immediately think of wishful thinking, but belief operates at a much deeper biological level than most realize. Every belief we hold creates expectations. Those expectations influence attention. Attention influences perception. Perception influences behavior. And behavior influences outcomes. In this way, beliefs quietly shape the realities we experience every day. Imagine two individuals facing the same challenge. One sees an opportunity for growth. The other sees evidence of inevitable failure. The external situation may be identical, yet their internal realities differ dramatically. Their bodies respond differently. Their emotional states differ. Their decisions differ. Over time, their lives may move in completely different directions. The key insight here is not that thoughts magically alter the laws of nature. Rather, consciousness influences the pathways through which we engage with those laws. This understanding leads directly into the extraordinary relationship between emotion and biology. For many years, emotions were treated as secondary experiences separate from physical health. Today, evidence increasingly suggests that emotional states are deeply intertwined with biological processes. When we experience chronic fear, stress hormones rise, inflammation can increase, sleep patterns change, immune function may become compromised. The body adapts to the emotional environment it repeatedly encounters. The opposite is also true. States associated with gratitude, connection, compassion, and emotional balance often correlate with measurable physiological benefits. Heart rhythms become more coherent. Stress responses moderate. Recovery mechanisms operate more efficiently. What interests me most is that the body appears to listen continuously to the emotional language we generate within ourselves. Every feeling becomes information. Every emotional pattern becomes a signal. And over time, those signals contribute to shaping our biological experience. This does not mean that positive thinking eliminates every difficulty. Life remains complex, challenges remain real, but it does suggest that our inner world possesses greater influence than many of us were taught to believe. The implications extend far beyond personal health. If consciousness participates in shaping individual experience, what happens when large groups of people share emotional states? Human beings are profoundly interconnected. Emotions spread through families, communities, organizations, and entire societies. We have all entered a room and immediately sensed tension without anyone speaking a word. We have all experienced moments when enthusiasm became contagious. Something important is happening in these exchanges. Information travels not only through language, but also through emotional resonance. This observation appears repeatedly throughout both ancient wisdom and modern research. Although the explanations differ, the central idea remains remarkably consistent. Human beings influence one another in ways that are often subtle, invisible, and powerful. Perhaps this is one reason why collective fear can transform social behavior so quickly. And perhaps it is also why collective hope can inspire extraordinary change. Reality, then, may not be a static environment acting upon passive observers. Instead, it may resemble a dynamic relationship between observation, interpretation, emotion, biology, and consciousness itself. The more I explore this possibility, the more I recognize that certainty becomes difficult to maintain. The universe appears layered. Beneath every answer lies another question. Beneath every discovery lies a deeper mystery. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not hidden somewhere among distant galaxies or microscopic particles. Perhaps it exists within the very awareness through which we experience everything. Because when we begin to understand how consciousness shapes perception and how perception shapes experience, we inevitably arrive at a question that changes the entire conversation. What if the limits we assume belong to reality are actually reflections of the limits we have accepted within ourselves? And what if those accepted limits are not fixed boundaries at all, but habits of perception that can evolve as our awareness expands? This possibility invites us to examine something that most of us rarely question. We tend to assume that our thoughts are simply reactions to the world around us. Something happens and then we think about it. Yet the relationship may be far more interactive than that. Every experience we have is filtered through patterns that have been developing throughout our lives. These patterns influence what we notice, what we ignore, what we expect, and ultimately what we believe is possible. Consider how two people can witness the same event and come away with completely different interpretations. One person may see evidence of danger, another may see an opportunity. Neither individual is necessarily observing a different reality. Instead, each is viewing reality through a different framework. The framework itself becomes part of the experience. This is where consciousness becomes especially significant. Consciousness is often discussed as though it were merely a byproduct of biological activity, something produced by the brain in the same way a machine generates output. Yet, despite remarkable advances in science, the nature of conscious awareness remains one of the greatest mysteries ever encountered. We can observe brain activity, we can measure electrical signals, we can identify regions associated with memory, emotion, and perception. But the subjective experience of being aware, the feeling of existing, observing, and experiencing remains difficult to explain through purely mechanical models. I find this fascinating because it suggests that there may be dimensions of reality that cannot be fully understood through measurement alone. Some of the most important aspects of human life cannot be placed inside a laboratory instrument, meaning cannot be weighed. Love cannot be measured with a ruler. Inspiration cannot be captured inside a container. Yet these experiences shape civilizations. They influence decisions. They transform lives. Their effects are undeniably real. Perhaps one reason reality appears more complex than we once believed is that our methods of investigation are still evolving. Scientific tools excel at examining external phenomena, but consciousness introduces an internal dimension that requires observation of a different kind. This does not mean abandoning science. In fact, I believe the opposite is true. The future may depend upon bringing rigorous scientific inquiry together with a deeper understanding of subjective experience. For much of history, these domains were treated as separate. Objective knowledge occupied one side, personal experience occupied the other. Today, that separation appears increasingly difficult to maintain. Research into neuroplasticity offers an interesting example. For many years, scientists believed that the adult brain was relatively fixed. Once development reached a certain stage, change was thought to be limited. Yet modern research revealed something very different. The brain continuously reorganizes itself, New neural connections form. Existing pathways strengthen or weaken. Experience influences structure. Attention influences experience. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. What captures my attention is the implication behind this discovery. If repeated thoughts and emotional patterns can contribute to reshaping neural architecture, then our inner world is participating in physical change. The distinction between mind and body becomes less rigid. The boundary begins to blur. Suddenly, personal growth is no longer just a philosophical concept. It becomes a biological process. Every new skill, every perspective shift, every meaningful insight, each contributes to a gradual reorganization of how we engage with reality. This understanding encourages a very different approach to challenges. When difficulties arise, our instinct is often to focus exclusively on external conditions. We attempt to change circumstances while overlooking the internal patterns through which those circumstances are interpreted. Yet sometimes the greatest transformation occurs when awareness itself changes. A problem that once appeared overwhelming may look entirely different from a broader perspective. A limitation that seemed permanent may reveal itself as temporary. A fear that once controlled behavior may lose its influence when examined consciously. The external situation may remain unchanged for a period of time, but the relationship to that situation changes, and that shift can alter everything. I often think about how many possibilities remain invisible simply because we are not prepared to perceive them. History provides countless examples. Ideas once considered impossible eventually became accepted knowledge. Phenomena once dismissed became measurable realities. Entire paradigms shifted because someone dared to question assumptions that everyone else accepted. This pattern suggests an important lesson. The edge of human understanding is never a fixed location. It moves, it expands, it evolves with every generation. What seems mysterious today may become obvious tomorrow. And what seems obvious today may eventually be recognized as incomplete. Humility, therefore, becomes essential, not because knowledge lacks value, but because reality consistently proves larger than our current explanations. The more we learn, the more we discover how much remains unknown. And perhaps that realization is not frustrating, but liberating. It means the story is still unfolding. It means possibility remains alive. It means human consciousness may possess capacities that are only beginning to be understood. When I reflect on the convergence of ancient observations and modern discoveries, a common theme emerges again and again. Human beings are not merely spectators of reality. We are participants. Our beliefs influence perception. Our emotions influence biology. Our attention influences experience. Our awareness influences the choices that shape our lives. None of this suggests that we control every circumstance. Life contains uncertainty, complexity, and countless variables beyond individual influence. But it does suggest that our relationship with reality is more interactive than many traditional models assumed. The observer and the observed may be connected in ways we are only beginning to explore. And if that is true, then one of the most important questions we can ask is not simply what reality is made of. The deeper question may be how our state of consciousness determines what aspects of reality become available to us. Because once we begin exploring that possibility, we encounter an even more intriguing idea. What if consciousness is not merely reacting to reality, but actively selecting from a wider field of possibilities? This is where many people become uncomfortable, not because the idea is irrational, but because it challenges the deeply rooted assumption that the world is entirely separate from the observer. Throughout everyday life, we tend to experience reality as something happening to us. Circumstances arise, events unfold, and we respond accordingly. Yet when we look more carefully, we discover that experience is never formed by external events alone. Experience emerges from the meeting point between the outer world and the inner world. The same conversation can inspire one person and discourage another. The same opportunity can appear exciting to one individual and threatening to someone else. The same uncertainty can generate anxiety in one mind and curiosity in another. What changes is not necessarily the event itself. What changes is the consciousness engaging with it. This realization carries profound implications for how we understand personal transformation. Many people spend years attempting to change their lives while maintaining the same perceptions, assumptions, and emotional patterns that created their current experience. They seek new outcomes without developing a new relationship with reality. But lasting change often begins long before external conditions shift. It begins in awareness. Every major transformation starts with a different way of seeing. Before an inventor creates something revolutionary, they perceive a possibility others overlook. Before a person changes a destructive habit, they recognize a pattern previously operating unconsciously. Before a society evolves, enough individuals begin questioning assumptions that once seemed unquestionable. Awareness comes first. Action follows. Results emerge afterward. This sequence appears repeatedly throughout human history. The challenge, however, is that awareness requires attention, and attention has become one of the most valuable resources in the modern world. Every day we are surrounded by information, competing for our focus. Messages, notifications, opinions, predictions, distractions. The human nervous system was never designed to process endless streams of stimulation without pause. As a result, many people spend their lives reacting rather than observing. Reaction is automatic. Observation is intentional. Reaction pulls us into unconscious patterns. Observation allows us to recognize those patterns. The difference may seem subtle, but it changes everything. When we observe our thoughts, instead of immediately identifying with them, we create space. When we observe our emotions, instead of becoming overwhelmed by them, we gain clarity. When we observe our beliefs, instead of assuming they are absolute truths, we discover new possibilities. That space is where growth occurs. It is where conscious choice becomes possible. I believe one of the greatest misunderstandings about consciousness is the assumption that awareness is passive. In reality, awareness may be one of the most powerful forces available to us. Whatever we repeatedly bring into conscious awareness tends to change. A hidden fear loses some of its influence when clearly recognized. An unconscious habit becomes easier to modify when brought into the light of attention. A limiting belief begins to dissolve when examined honestly. Awareness does not instantly solve every problem, but it transforms our relationship with the problem. And that transformation often becomes the beginning of meaningful change. This principle can also be seen in the relationship between expectation and perception. Human beings rarely experience reality in a completely neutral manner. Our expectations constantly shape what we notice. If we expect hostility, we often detect signs of threat. If we expect opportunity, we become more likely to recognize possibilities. If we expect failure, our attention naturally gravitates toward evidence supporting that belief. This does not mean expectations create reality in a simplistic sense. Rather, expectations influence the lens through which reality is interpreted. And because interpretation affects decisions, the consequences can become surprisingly significant over time. A person convinced that improvement is impossible may stop looking for solutions. A person who believes growth remains possible continues searching. Months later, their lives may look dramatically different. The difference began with perception. What fascinates me is that both ancient wisdom traditions and modern psychological research point towards similar conclusions. They use different language, different frameworks, and different methods, yet they repeatedly emphasize the importance of conscious awareness in shaping human experience. This convergence deserves attention, not because it provides final answers, but because it highlights patterns that appear across cultures and generations. Again and again, we encounter the suggestion that reality is more participatory than we once assumed. Again and again, we find evidence that consciousness matters. Again and again, we discover that inner states influence outer experiences in ways that are often underestimated. Perhaps this is why periods of profound insight frequently feel transformative. Nothing external may have changed in that moment. The world remains the same. The environment remains the same. Yet everything appears different. A new understanding emerges. A larger perspective becomes visible. An old assumption loses its hold, and suddenly reality itself seems to expand. What actually changed? The structure of awareness. The lens shifted. The observer evolved. The world was not necessarily transformed, but the relationship with the world was transformed. This distinction may be one of the most important insights available to us, because if consciousness influences how reality is experienced, then developing consciousness becomes far more than an intellectual exercise. It becomes a practical skill, a lifelong process, a form of exploration that reaches into every aspect of human existence. The goal is not to escape reality. The goal is to engage with reality more completely, to perceive more clearly, to respond more consciously, to recognize possibilities that remain invisible when awareness is limited by fear, distraction, or assumption. And as our understanding continues to evolve, an even deeper question begins to emerge. If human consciousness possesses the capacity to influence perception, biology, behavior, and experience, then perhaps the next frontier is not merely discovering what reality is. Perhaps the next frontier is discovering what human beings are truly capable of becoming when they fully understand the extraordinary relationship between awareness and the world they inhabit. Because beyond that question lies a possibility that has fascinated thinkers, scientists, and observers for generations. Because beyond that question lies a possibility that has fascinated thinkers, scientists, and observers for generations. What if human potential extends far beyond the limits we currently assume? This question has appeared in different forms throughout history. Sometimes it emerged through philosophy, sometimes through scientific inquiry, sometimes through direct observation of extraordinary individuals who seemed capable of achieving what others considered impossible. What interests me is not the pursuit of supernatural explanations. It is the recognition that human capability consistently expands whenever old assumptions are challenged. There was a time when running a mile in under 4 minutes was considered physically impossible. Experts believed the human body simply could not sustain such performance. Then someone accomplished it. Almost immediately, others followed. The physical structure of humanity had not suddenly changed. What changed was the perception of what was possible. A limitation that appeared absolute revealed itself to be conditional. This pattern appears again and again. The boundaries we accept often influence the boundaries we experience. Of course, reality contains genuine constraints. Gravity exists whether we believe in it or not. Biological laws operate regardless of personal opinion. Yet within those larger frameworks, human potential frequently proves greater than expected. The question becomes, how many limitations are truly fixed, and how many are inherited assumptions? This is where consciousness plays a crucial role. The stories we tell ourselves shape our engagement with the world. Some stories expand possibility. Others restrict it. Many of these stories operate below conscious awareness. They are absorbed through culture, education, family experiences, and repeated emotional conditioning. Over time, they become invisible. We no longer recognize them as stories. We experience them as reality itself. But there is a profound difference between reality and our interpretation of reality. The moment we recognize that difference, new possibilities begin to emerge. Consider how often people underestimate their own capacity for adaptation. When facing uncertainty, the mind tends to project current limitations into the future. We assume that because something feels difficult now, it will remain difficult indefinitely. Yet human beings are remarkably adaptable. Skills improve. Perspectives evolve. Understanding deepens. Strength develops through challenge. Again and again, people discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Not because those capabilities suddenly appeared, but because circumstances revealed what was already present. This realization changes how we view obstacles. An obstacle is no longer merely something blocking progress. It becomes information. It reveals assumptions. It exposes patterns. It highlights areas where growth may be possible. The challenge remains real, but its meaning changes, and meaning has tremendous influence on human experience. Research continues to demonstrate that interpretation affects physiology. Two individuals may encounter similar circumstances while experiencing dramatically different biological responses based upon how those circumstances are perceived. One interprets a situation as overwhelming. Another interprets the same situation as demanding but manageable. The body responds differently. Stress responses differ. Decision-making differs. Outcomes often differ. This does not imply that challenges are imaginary. It suggests that consciousness participates in determining how those challenges are experienced. The implication is both empowering and humbling. Empowering because it reveals opportunities for growth. Humbling because it reminds us that our perceptions are not always complete. The mind naturally seeks certainty, yet reality repeatedly demonstrates that certainty can be deceptive. Many of the greatest discoveries in human history emerged when someone questioned what everyone else assumed was already understood. The deeper we investigate reality, the more complexity we encounter. At one level, matter appears solid. At another level, it consists mostly of empty space and energetic interactions. At one level, human beings appear separate. At another level, we exist within vast networks of biological, ecological, and social interdependence. At one level, consciousness feels intensely personal. At another level, it connects us through shared experiences, emotions, language, and understanding. Reality seems to possess layers upon layers of depth. Every time we believe we have reached the final explanation, another level appears. I find this endlessly fascinating because it suggests that mystery is not a temporary obstacle to knowledge. Mystery may be woven into the structure of existence itself, not as something to fear, but as something to explore. Curiosity becomes essential. Without curiosity, assumptions harden into limitations. Without curiosity, familiar explanations become invisible prisons. Without curiosity, growth slows. But when curiosity remains alive, awareness continues expanding. Questions become more valuable than rigid conclusions. Exploration becomes more important than certainty. Learning becomes a lifelong process rather than a destination. This perspective also transforms our understanding of success. Many people define success entirely through external achievements. Accomplishments matter, of course. Goals matter. Progress matters. Yet there is another dimension that often receives less attention, the evolution of awareness itself. A person may achieve impressive external results while remaining trapped by fear, resentment, or unconscious habits. Another person may experience profound inner growth despite facing significant external challenges. Which transformation is more important? Perhaps both matter. Perhaps true development involves aligning external achievement with internal understanding. Because without awareness, success can feel empty. Without meaning, accomplishment can lose its significance. Without conscious engagement, even extraordinary opportunities may fail to create fulfillment. This brings us back to the central theme that continues appearing throughout our exploration. Reality is more complex than we once believed. Not merely because science reveals new discoveries, not merely because consciousness remains mysterious, but because the relationship between observer and experience appears richer, deeper, and more dynamic than previous models suggested. We are learning that perception matters, attention matters, emotion matters, belief matters, awareness matters. These are not separate elements operating independently. They form an interconnected system through which human experience unfolds. And as we begin to appreciate the depth of that system, another remarkable possibility comes into view. Perhaps the most significant discoveries of the future will not emerge solely from examining the external universe. Perhaps they will arise from understanding the extraordinary capacities hidden within human consciousness itself. Because if reality is far more complex than we once believed, then it is entirely possible that our understanding of ourselves remains only the beginning of a much larger story. And the evidence for that possibility becomes even more intriguing when we start examining, and the evidence for that possibility becomes even more intriguing when we start examining the role of attention itself as a shaping force within human experience. Attention is something we rarely question, yet it determines the entire structure of what we call reality in any given moment. Right now, as I speak, there are countless stimuli available to awareness: sounds in the environment, sensations in the body, thoughts rising and fading, memories forming subtle background patterns, yet only a narrow selection enters conscious focus. That selection becomes experience. Everything else effectively disappears from the lived world. This filtering process is so constant that we mistake it for reality itself. But what we are actually experiencing is a curated version of existence shaped by the direction of attention. If attention shifts, experience shifts. If attention narrows, reality feels limited. If attention expands, new layers of experience become available. This raises an important question: who or what is directing attention? At times, attention appears voluntary. We choose to focus on a task, a conversation, a thought. Yet at other times, attention is captured without consent. A strong emotion pulls awareness inward. A sudden sound pulls it outward. A memory surfaces and dominates perception. It becomes clear that attention is influenced by both conscious intention and unconscious conditioning. And this dual influence creates a powerful dynamic. Whatever repeatedly captures attention begins to shape mental architecture. Repeated attention strengthens neural pathways. Repeated emotional focus reinforces certain interpretations of life. Over time, these reinforced patterns become automatic. What once required effort becomes instinct. This is how perception stabilizes into a consistent worldview. But stability does not necessarily mean accuracy. It simply means repetition has occurred often enough to feel familiar. This is where conscious awareness becomes essential once again, because awareness offers the possibility of interruption. The moment we notice where attention is going, we introduce choice, not always immediate control, but the possibility of redirection. And even a small shift in attention can begin to alter the trajectory of experience. Consider how easily the mind can become absorbed in fear-based thinking. A single concern arises. Attention returns to it repeatedly. With each return, the emotional intensity grows. The body responds. Tension increases. Interpretations become narrower. Possibilities seem to shrink. Yet if attention is redirected even briefly, the entire internal environment begins to change. New information becomes visible. Perspective widens. Emotional intensity softens. This does not eliminate the original situation, but it changes the state from which the situation is experienced. That distinction is crucial, because many of the limitations we encounter are not located in external reality, but in the internal state through which reality is interpreted. This brings us to another important aspect of consciousness: the relationship between memory and identity. We often think of ourselves as continuous, stable individuals, a single narrative stretching from past to present. Yet what we call identity is largely constructed from memory. Memory is not a perfect recording, it is reconstructive. It changes each time it is accessed. It is influenced by present emotions, beliefs, and expectations. This means identity is not a fixed structure. It is a living process, a continuously updated interpretation of who we are based on selected memories and current perspectives. And because attention influences which memories are reinforced, identity itself is partially shaped by what we repeatedly focus on. If attention consistently returns to past limitations, identity can become constrained by those limitations. If attention shifts toward growth, learning, and possibility, identity begins to evolve in that direction. This does not erase the past, but it changes its influence on the present. This understanding opens the door to something deeply significant: the possibility that human beings are not bound by static self-definitions. We are adaptable systems of awareness capable of reinterpretation and transformation. And if identity is flexible, then potential is also flexible. Not infinite in a simplistic sense, but far more dynamic than commonly assumed. This leads naturally into the question of how change actually occurs within human experience. Many people imagine change as a direct act of willpower. A decision is made and transformation follows immediately. But real change is often more gradual. It involves layers of adjustment across perception, emotion, behavior, and belief. First, something is noticed. Then it is questioned. Then it is reinterpreted. Then new patterns are practiced. And over time, those patterns become integrated. What appears as sudden transformation is often the result of accumulated shifts that were previously invisible. This is why awareness is so central. Without awareness, change cannot begin. Without repetition, change cannot stabilize. Without emotional engagement, change cannot integrate deeply. The process is multidimensional, and it often requires patience with the unfolding of internal reorganization. One of the most overlooked aspects of transformation is the discomfort that accompanies it. When long-standing patterns begin to shift, the mind may resist. Familiar interpretations feel safe, even when they are limiting. Unfamiliar perspectives can feel uncertain even when they are liberating. This creates an internal tension between stability and growth. Many people unconsciously choose stability simply because it feels known. But growth requires stepping into unfamiliar territory. Not recklessly, but consciously. Not through force, but through awareness and willingness. As this process unfolds, something remarkable often happens. What once felt like effort becomes more natural. What once required discipline becomes easier. What once seemed distant begins to feel accessible. This is not because external reality has changed dramatically. It is because internal organization has shifted. Perception reorganizes experience. Experience reinforces new perception. And the cycle continues. Over time, a new baseline of awareness emerges. At this stage, people often describe life differently. They notice subtleties they previously ignored. They respond rather than react. They observe patterns rather than being controlled by them. They experience a sense of expanded possibility, not because life has become free of challenges, but because their relationship with challenges has transformed. And this brings us closer to a final profound realization that continues to surface across both scientific exploration and introspective inquiry. If attention shapes perception, and perception shapes experience, and experience shapes identity, then the quality of consciousness becomes one of the most important factors in determining how life unfolds. Which means that understanding consciousness is not a philosophical luxury. It is a practical necessity for navigating reality itself. And as we move deeper into this understanding, we begin to approach a threshold where an entirely new question emerges, one that suggests we may only be standing at the edge of what it truly means to be aware in a universe that is far more interconnected, responsive, and mysterious than we ever imagined. Because once we begin to fully consider the implications of this interconnectedness, we are led inevitably toward, because once we begin to fully consider the implications of this interconnectedness, we are led inevitably toward a deeper understanding of reality as a continuous feedback system between mind, body, environment, and experience. In this view, nothing exists in isolation. Every perception is influenced by context. Every thought is shaped by prior experience. Every emotion emerges within a biological and environmental setting that is constantly shifting. What we call reality may therefore be less like a fixed landscape and more like an ongoing conversation between internal states and external signals. And in that conversation, consciousness appears to function as both participant and interpreter. Modern neuroscience offers an interesting parallel to this idea through the concept that the brain is not simply reacting to the world, but continuously predicting it. Rather than passively receiving information, the nervous system constructs internal models of what it expects to encounter. Incoming sensory data is then compared against those predictions. When there is a match, experience feels stable. When there is a mismatch, attention intensifies and adjustment occurs. This means that perception is not purely driven by what is out there, but by the relationship between expectation and input. In other words, we are not simply seeing reality. We are actively assembling it moment by moment. This assembly process is deeply influenced by prior learning, emotional conditioning, and attentional habits. Which brings us back to a critical realization. If the brain is continuously building a model of reality, then the quality of that model matters. A model shaped by fear will interpret ambiguity differently than a model shaped by curiosity. A model shaped by past trauma will scan the environment differently than a model shaped by safety. A model shaped by openness will generate different possibilities than the model shaped by limitation. The world may remain objectively complex, but the experience of that world is filtered through these internal constructions. And because these constructions are adaptable, the experience of reality is also adaptable. This is where the idea of coherence becomes important. Coherence refers to a state in which internal systems, emotional, cognitive, and physiological, operate in alignment rather than fragmentation. When internal signals are coherent, perception tends to stabilize. Thoughts become clearer. Emotional responses become more regulated. Decision-making becomes more integrated. From a physiological perspective, coherence can be observed in patterns such as heart rhythm variability and nervous system regulation, where the body reflects a more synchronized internal state. But beyond the physiological level, coherence may also influence how experience is interpreted. When internal systems are in conflict, perception often becomes distorted or narrowed. When internal systems are aligned, perception tends to widen and become more flexible. This suggests that clarity of perception is not only an intellectual condition, but also an embodied one. And it raises an important question. If internal coherence influences perception, then what role does environment play in shaping coherence itself? Human beings do not exist in isolation from their surroundings. We are constantly influenced by subtle signals from the environment and from each other. Tone of voice, body language, emotional expression, social atmosphere. These factors shape internal states in ways that often occur below conscious awareness. In group settings, for example, emotional states can shift rapidly across individuals without explicit communication. A calm presence can stabilize a tense environment. A stressed presence can amplify uncertainty. This phenomenon suggests that human systems are sensitive to one another in ways that extend beyond language alone. Some researchers describe this as emotional resonance, where internal states become partially synchronized through interaction. From a broader perspective, this implies that consciousness may not be strictly confined to individual boundaries, but may participate in distributed patterns of influence across groups. Not in a mystical sense, but in a systems-based sense, where feedback loops connect individuals through shared environments and mutual perception. Each person becomes part of a larger dynamic field of interaction. Within this field, attention, emotion, and behavior continuously shape one another. What one individual expresses becomes input for another. What another responds with becomes feedback for the first. Over time, these interactions create patterns that can stabilize or destabilize collective experience. This is one reason environments can feel noticeably different even without obvious external changes. The same physical space can feel calm or chaotic depending on the internal states of the people within it. This points again to a central idea. Experience is not only individual, it is relational. And if experience is relational, then reality as we know it is partly constructed through interaction. At this level of understanding, the separation between observer and observed begins to soften. Not disappear entirely, but become more permeable than previously assumed. We begin to see reality as a dynamic interface rather than a static structure. An interface shaped by perception, shaped by expectation, shaped by emotional tone, shaped by biological state, and shaped by interaction with others. And in such an interface, even small shifts in awareness can produce meaningful changes in experience. A moment of recognition can interrupt a habitual reaction. A pause in attention can reveal a new interpretation. A shift in emotional state can alter perception of the same situation. These are subtle changes, but they accumulate over time. They form the basis of transformation at both individual and collective levels. Yet, even as we explore these patterns, an essential humility remains necessary. Because no matter how far we extend these models, reality continues to exceed them. Every framework is partial. Every explanation is incomplete. Every model simplifies something that is inherently more complex. And perhaps that is not a limitation to overcome, but a fundamental characteristic of existence itself. The more we understand, the more we recognize the depth of what remains unknown. This recognition does not diminish knowledge. It deepens curiosity. It keeps inquiry alive. It prevents certainty from becoming rigid, and it invites ongoing exploration into the nature of consciousness, perception, and reality itself. Because ultimately, the most profound insight may not be a final answer, but the realization that awareness is always operating within something larger than itself, something that continues to unfold in ways we are only beginning to sense. And as we move further into that unfolding, we begin to encounter questions that no longer point outward alone, but turn inward toward the very source of perception itself, where the next layer of understanding begins to reveal that the source of perception may be more dynamic than we ever assumed, not a single fixed point, but an unfolding process occurring in real time. This realization shifts everything, because if perception is a process rather than a position, then awareness is not something we simply possess. It is something we participate in continuously. Each moment of experience becomes an active construction shaped by incoming information, internal states, and the ever-changing context of life itself. And within that construction, there is a subtle but important space, a gap between stimulus and response, between what happens and how it is interpreted, between sensation and meaning. This space is often overlooked, yet it is where conscious choice becomes possible. Without that space, experience would collapse into pure reaction. With it, reflection becomes possible. And reflection is where awareness begins to evolve beyond automatic patterns. When we begin to notice this gap more consistently, something interesting happens. We start to realize that many of our responses are not actually chosen in the moment. They are familiar sequences, repeated so often that they feel natural. A thought arises, an emotion follows, a meaning is assigned, a reaction occurs, and the cycle completes itself before awareness fully engages. But once this pattern is seen clearly, it can no longer operate in complete obscurity. Even a small degree of awareness introduces interruption. And interruption creates possibility. This is where transformation begins to feel tangible rather than theoretical. Not through force, but through observation. Not by trying to eliminate patterns, but by seeing them clearly enough that they lose their unconscious control. This is a subtle shift, but a powerful one, because awareness does not need to fight experience. It only needs to illuminate it. And what is illuminated begins to change naturally over time. In this sense, consciousness behaves less like a tool and more like light. It does not impose structure. It reveals structure. It makes patterns visible that were previously hidden in automatic behavior. And once visible, those patterns can be understood rather than blindly followed. This is particularly significant when we consider emotional responses. Emotions often arise before conscious thought can intervene. They feel immediate, direct, and unquestionable. But emotions are not isolated events. They are integrated responses involving memory, perception, and biological signaling. A present moment may trigger an emotional response that actually belongs to past experience. Without awareness, that connection remains hidden. The present becomes colored by the past without recognition. But when awareness is present, a shift occurs. The emotion is still felt, but it is also recognized as a process. It is observed rather than fully identified with. And in that observation, space emerges. Space for understanding, space for regulation, space for choice. This does not mean emotions are suppressed or denied. It means they are integrated into awareness rather than dominating it. And integration often leads to greater clarity rather than conflict. Over time, this practice of observation begins to reshape internal patterns. The nervous system adapts. Attention becomes more stable. Emotional reactivity softens. Not because life becomes easier, but because engagement becomes more conscious. And this has profound implications for how we relate to the external world. Because as internal reactivity decreases, perception becomes less distorted by immediate emotional filtering. Situations can be seen with greater depth. Responses become more deliberate. understanding increases. In this way, inner transformation naturally influences outer experience, not by altering external conditions directly, but by changing the lens through which those conditions are interpreted. And as this lens evolves, something subtle yet powerful begins to emerge. A sense of continuity between inner awareness and external reality. Not separation, but relationship. Not control, but participation. This perspective invites a very different way of moving through life. Rather than constantly trying to manage external outcomes, attention shifts toward understanding internal states. Rather than resisting experience, awareness begins to engage with it. Rather than reacting automatically, perception becomes more intentional. And over time, this intentionality develops into a kind of embodied intelligence. Not intellectual knowledge alone, but lived awareness integrated across thought, emotion, and behavior. From this standpoint, reality is no longer experienced as something happening to us. It becomes something happening with us. A continuous interaction between awareness and the world it perceives. And within that interaction, even ordinary moments take on new significance. A pause before responding becomes meaningful. A breath before reacting becomes meaningful. A moment of noticing becomes meaningful because each of these moments represents a point of potential shift within the larger system of experience. This is where the deeper implications of consciousness begin to reveal themselves. If awareness can alter perception, and perception can alter experience, then even small shifts in awareness may have far-reaching effects over time. Not immediately dramatic, but cumulative, subtle adjustments that gradually reshape the overall pattern of life. And as this understanding deepens, we begin to approach a threshold where the distinction between inner and outer reality becomes increasingly fluid, and where the exploration of consciousness itself begins to reveal that what we once thought of as a stable, external world may actually be far more responsive to the quality of awareness engaging with it. Because at that level of understanding, it becomes increasingly clear that the distinction between observer and observed may be far less absolute than our everyday experience suggests. This does not mean the external world is an illusion or that it ceases to exist independently. Rather, it suggests that what we call the world is always encountered through layers of interpretation, filtering, and internal construction that are inseparable from the act of perceiving itself. In other words, reality is not denied, it is mediated. And mediation changes everything. When we begin to recognize this, even in a subtle way, the sense of certainty we once attached to perception begins to loosen, not in a destabilizing manner, but in a way that introduces flexibility, a kind of mental elasticity that allows experience to be held without immediately fixing it into rigid meaning. This flexibility is important because rigid perception tends to compress possibility. It narrows interpretation. It reinforces repetition. Flexible perception, on the other hand, allows new interpretations to emerge from the same experience. Nothing external needs to change for understanding to shift. Only awareness needs to widen. This widening is not abstract. It can be observed in very ordinary moments. A conversation that once felt confrontational may, upon reflection, reveal underlying misunderstanding rather than opposition. A situation once labeled as failure may later be seen as redirection. An event initially experienced as loss may reveal hidden structures of growth that were not visible at the time. What changed in each case was not the event itself, but the interpretive framework surrounding it. And that framework is continuously shaped by the state of consciousness through which experience is filtered. This brings us to an important realization about learning itself. Learning is not simply the accumulation of information. It is the reorganization of perception. When genuine learning occurs, something subtle shifts in the way reality is structured in the mind. Old assumptions lose rigidity. New connections form between previously unrelated ideas, and experience begins to be interpreted through a broader lens. This is why insight often feels like expansion. Not because something external has been added, but because internal structure has reorganized. In that moment, reality appears to open up, even though the external environment remains unchanged. This suggests that knowledge is not merely stored, it is lived, and it actively shapes the field of perception through which all future experiences are interpreted. From this perspective, consciousness is not a passive container for experience, but an active participant in shaping how experience is organized. And if that is true, then the quality of attention becomes one of the most influential forces in shaping the continuity of lived reality. Attention determines what is reinforced. What is reinforced becomes familiar. What becomes familiar forms expectation, and expectation shapes perception. This cycle operates continuously, often below conscious awareness. Yet within this cycle lies an opportunity for interruption, because attention is not entirely fixed. It can be observed, it can be redirected, it can be refined, and even small refinements in attention can gradually alter the structure of perception over time. This is where the concept of inner coherence becomes even more relevant. When attention is scattered, perception tends to fragment. When attention is concentrated, perception becomes more unified. Fragmentation often leads to internal conflict, where different interpretations compete for dominance. Coherence allows these interpretations to be integrated into a more stable field of awareness. In that state, experience feels less divided. Thoughts, emotions, and perceptions begin to align rather than oppose one another. This alignment does not eliminate complexity, but it organizes it in a way that is easier to navigate, and navigation itself becomes more intentional. From this standpoint, personal transformation is not about becoming someone entirely different. It is about reducing internal contradictions so that awareness can function with greater clarity. Clarity does not necessarily mean simplicity. It means reduced distortion. And reduced distortion allows for more accurate perception of both internal states and external conditions. This has practical implications for decision-making. When perception is distorted by unresolved internal conflict, choices are often reactive. When perception is clearer, choices become more responsive. This difference may appear subtle, but over time it significantly influences the direction of experience, because each choice contributes to the formation of future conditions, and those conditions in turn influence future perception. This recursive relationship between perception and experience suggests that consciousness is always engaged in a kind of feedback loop with reality. Each moment of awareness contributes to the shaping of the next moment. And each moment contains within it the residue of all previous moments. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is interconnected through layers of perception, memory, and interpretation. Even time, as it is experienced, may be influenced by the state of consciousness. In moments of deep engagement, time can feel compressed. In moments of tension or anticipation, it can feel stretched. In moments of clarity, it can feel spacious. This variability suggests that time as lived experience is not purely external, but partially constructed through internal states. And if time itself is experienced through consciousness, then consciousness becomes central not only to perception of space and matter, but also to the unfolding of lived duration. At this point, the boundaries between observation, interpretation, and existence itself begin to blur in subtle ways. Not as a collapse of meaning, but as an invitation to deeper inquiry. Because the more closely we examine experience, the more we encounter layers of interdependence that resist simple categorization. The observer influences the observed. The observed influences the observer. And within that relationship, experience unfolds dynamically, continuously, without a final point of separation. This does not lead to certainty. It leads to awareness, and awareness by its nature is always present, always shifting, always revealing new dimensions depending on the depth of attention applied. Which brings us once again to a central insight that continues to surface through all layers of exploration. Reality is not a static object to be fully understood from a single perspective. It is a living process of interaction, continuously shaped by the quality of consciousness engaging with it. And as this realization deepens further, it opens the door to an even more subtle question, one that suggests that what we call understanding reality may actually be inseparable from understanding the evolving nature of awareness itself. Because at that point, the inquiry turns inward once again toward the recognition that the very act of understanding reality cannot be separated from the mechanism through which understanding arises. In other words, the observer is not standing outside the system attempting to decode it from a distance. The observer is part of the system being observed. This creates a subtle but important shift in perspective. Instead of asking only what is reality made of, the question becomes, what is it like to be the process through which reality is known? This turns attention inward, not as an abstract philosophical exercise, but as a direct investigation into lived experience. What is happening right now in this moment, before interpretation stabilizes it into meaning? There is sensation. There is perception. There is awareness of perception. And there is a continuous movement between these layers. Most of the time, these layers appear seamless. Experience feels unified, immediate, and self-evident. But when examined closely, it becomes clear that this unity is constructed through rapid integration. The mind does not simply receive reality. It assembles it. This assembly happens so quickly that it feels instantaneous. Yet within that immediacy lies a complex orchestration of sensory input, memory activation, prediction, emotional evaluation, and intentional selection. Each of these processes contributes to what is finally experienced as the present moment. And the present moment is not a fixed point. It is an ongoing synthesis. This realization opens another important dimension of inquiry, metacognition. Metacognition is the capacity to observe one's own thinking processes while they are occurring. It is awareness becoming aware of itself in action. At first, this may appear subtle or even abstract, but in practice, it has profound implications. When metacognition is active, thoughts are no longer simply experienced as reality. They are recognized as mental events occurring within reality. This distinction may seem small, but it fundamentally changes the relationship between the thinker and thought. A thought that is unobserved tends to feel authoritative. A thought that is observed tends to feel like one possibility among many. This shift reduces automatic identification with internal narratives. And as identification loosens, flexibility increases. Flexibility is crucial because rigid identification often leads to habitual patterns of interpretation that repeat regardless of context. With metacognitive awareness, these patterns become visible. And once visible, they become accessible to change. This is not about controlling thoughts in a forceful way. It is about understanding their origin, structure, and influence. Over time, this understanding leads to a more spacious form of awareness, one in which thoughts arise and pass without necessarily defining the entire field of experience. Within this spaciousness, another phenomenon becomes more noticeable: the relationship between attention and embodiment. The body is often treated as separate from consciousness and everyday thinking, yet lived experience suggests otherwise. Every thought has a subtle physiological correlate. Every emotion carries a bodily signature. Every shift in attention produces changes in internal sensation. Breath patterns adjust. Muscle tension shifts. Heart rhythm responds. The body is not simply carrying consciousness. It is participating in it. This means awareness is not only a mental event. It is an embodied experience, and when attention becomes more refined, these bodily signals become more perceptible. This allows for a different kind of intelligence to emerge. Not purely conceptual intelligence, but somatic intelligence. An intelligence rooted in the continuous feedback between perception and physiology. When this feedback loop is ignored, experience can become fragmented. But when it is recognized, a deeper coherence begins to form between mind and body. In this state, perception is not just interpreted intellectually, it is felt throughout the entire system of being. This integration has another interesting effect. It slows down the automatic rush toward interpretation. Instead of immediately labeling experience, awareness can linger in sensation long enough to perceive nuance. And in that nuance, new information becomes available. Information that is often lost when experience is reduced too quickly into fixed meaning. The slowing down is not inefficiency, it is refinement. It allows perception to become more accurate, more sensitive, more responsive. And from this refined state, a different kind of insight can emerge, one that is not forced or constructed, but recognized as if something that was already present becomes visible only when the noise of habitual interpretation quiets enough for it to be seen. This leads to another layer of understanding about transformation. Transformation is often imagined as addition, gaining new knowledge, acquiring new skills, developing new perspectives. But transformation can also occur through subtraction, through the release of unnecessary interpretation, through the reduction of cognitive noise, through the softening of rigid assumptions. When unnecessary complexity falls away, what remains is often simpler but clearer. Not less meaningful, but more directly experienced. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is clarity without distortion. And within clarity, perception becomes more sensitive to subtle shifts in experience. Small changes become noticeable. Internal states become easier to recognize. External patterns become easier to interpret without distortion. This sensitivity can gradually reshape how life is navigated, not by imposing control, but by increasing awareness of what is already occurring. In this way, life becomes less about reacting to events and more about participating consciously in their unfolding. And participation introduces a different quality of engagement, a sense of presence that is not dependent on external conditions, but on the quality of awareness itself. At this level of understanding, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate perception from participation, because to perceive is already to participate. And to participate is already to influence the field of experience through attention, interpretation, and response. This brings the inquiry back to a central realization that continues to deepen as awareness expands. The nature of reality cannot be fully understood without also understanding the nature of awareness itself. They are not separate subjects. They are interwoven aspects of a single unfolding process, a process that is continuously shaping itself through the very act of being observed. And as this recognition settles more deeply into experience, it becomes clear that what we are encountering is not a static universe waiting to be explained, but an evolving relationship between consciousness and the field in which it appears, a relationship that continues to reveal new layers of complexity the more attentively it is explored. Because at the heart of it all, there remains one final implication that cannot yet be fully resolved, only approached, and that is, because at the heart of it all, there remains one final implication that cannot yet be fully resolved, only approached, and that is the recognition that awareness itself may be both the question and the answer unfolding simultaneously within the same field of experience. This idea is not something that can be grasped through intellectual effort alone. In fact, the more tightly it is grasped, the more it seems to slip away. It behaves less like a conclusion and more like a living inquiry that refines itself the moment it is observed. When I sit with this possibility, I notice something subtle. The mind naturally tries to position awareness as an object, something to be analyzed, understood, or described. Yet awareness is never truly distant enough to be objectified in the same way as external phenomena. It is always here, always present, always the medium through which anything is known. This creates a paradox that cannot be resolved in the usual sense. Because any attempt to step outside awareness in order to examine it is itself occurring within awareness. So instead of stepping outside, the only movement available is deeper recognition, a shift in familiarity, a softening of assumption, a return to direct experience without immediately converting it into interpretation. When this shift occurs, even briefly, experience feels different, not because anything external has changed, but because the framing of experience loosens. The rigid boundary between observer and observed becomes less defined. There is still perception, there is still thought, There is still sensation, but there is also a subtle awareness of the space in which all of it appears. That space is difficult to describe, yet unmistakable when directly noticed. It is not empty in a void-like sense. It is full of potential, full of movement, full of emergence. From this perspective, reality is no longer experienced as a collection of separate objects interacting mechanically. Instead, it begins to resemble a continuous field of unfolding patterns, where distinctions are useful but not absolute. This has a profound effect on how meaning itself is experienced. Meaning is often assumed to be something we discover, as if it already exists, fully formed, and waiting to be found. But meaning may also be something that arises through interaction between awareness and experience. In other words, meaning is not only perceived, it is generated in real time. A single event can hold multiple meanings depending on context, state of mind, and level of attention. What feels insignificant in one moment can become deeply meaningful in another, not because the event changed, but because the interpretive field around it shifted. This suggests that meaning is not fixed within events themselves. It is relational, and relational properties are inherently dynamic. This brings us to an important realization about human experience. Stability is often assumed, but variation is the rule. We seek consistency in identity, in perception, in understanding, yet when examined closely, we find that everything is continuously in motion. Thoughts arise and dissolve. Emotions shift in waves. Sensations fluctuate. Attention moves. Even what we call self is a changing configuration of memory, perception, and interpretation, held together by continuity of awareness. There is no single static point that remains unchanged beneath experience. Instead, there is a pattern of continuity created by ongoing processes. This continuity is what allows us to function in the world. Without it, experience would feel fragmented and disorienting. But continuity does not require rigidity. It can exist alongside change. In fact, continuity may depend on change, because without change, there would be no perception of flow, no sense of time, no unfolding experience. This brings another layer of complexity to our understanding of transformation. If everything is already changing, then transformation is not about introducing change itself. It is about altering the direction, coherence, or quality of existing change, a shift in trajectory rather than the creation of movement from nothing. This is why awareness plays such a central role. Awareness does not force change. It influences orientation. It allows patterns to be seen differently, and in being seen differently, they begin to reorganize. Not through external pressure, but through internal recognition. This is also why small insights can sometimes have disproportionate effects. A single moment of clarity can reframe years of experience. Not by erasing the past, but by changing how the past is integrated into the present. In that sense, insight is not accumulation. It is reorganization. And reorganization is a property of systems, not isolated events, which leads to another important perspective. Human consciousness may be best understood not as a static entity, but as a dynamic system operating within multiple layers of feedback. Feedback between thought and emotion, between perception and action, between memory and interpretation, between internal state and external environment. Each layer influences the others continuously. And within this network of influence, awareness functions as both participant and observer, not separate from the system, but aware of the system while being part of it. This dual role creates a unique capacity, the capacity to reflect while experiencing, to notice while participating, to observe patterns while being influenced by them. This capacity is what allows learning, adaptation, and transformation to occur. Without it, experience would be purely reactive. With it, experience becomes reflective, and reflection introduces the possibility of evolution. Not just biological evolution across generations, but experiential evolution within a single lifetime. As awareness becomes more refined, the relationship between stimulus and response becomes less automatic. A pause emerges, a space opens, And within that space, new possibilities appear. Not because the external world suddenly changed, but because perception is no longer locked into a single interpretation. This is where freedom begins to take shape, not as absence of limitation, but as flexibility within limitation. The ability to respond rather than merely react. The ability to interpret rather than merely absorb. The ability to participate consciously in the unfolding of experience. And as this participation deepens, a subtle shift begins to occur in how life itself is understood. Life is no longer experienced as something happening independently of awareness. It is experienced as something unfolding through awareness, not controlled by it in an absolute sense, but expressed through it in every moment. This realization does not eliminate mystery, it expands it. Because if awareness is the medium through which reality is experienced, then understanding awareness becomes inseparable from understanding reality itself. And yet awareness cannot be fully captured, only directly experienced, which means that the most important aspects of existence may always remain just beyond conceptual definition, inviting continuous exploration rather than final resolution. And so the inquiry continues, not toward an ending, but toward a deeper sensitivity to what is already here, waiting to be noticed in the quiet space where perception forms itself anew in every moment, revealing once again that the act of noticing itself may be the most fundamental movement within the entire structure of human experience, a movement so subtle that it is often overlooked precisely because it is always already happening. When I turn attention toward this noticing, something interesting becomes apparent. There is always a difference between what is happening and the awareness that recognizes what is happening. Yet at the same time, they are inseparable in practice. I cannot observe experience without experience occurring. And I cannot have experience without some form of observation already being present. This inseparability creates a continuous loop that is difficult to reduce into simpler terms. It is not a linear process with a clear beginning and end. It is more like a living circle of awareness folding back into itself, moment after moment. Within this loop, perception and recognition continuously inform each other. Perception provides raw content. Recognition gives that content structure. Structure then influences future perception. And the cycle continues. This recursive quality may be one of the most fundamental features of consciousness because it suggests that awareness is not a passive mirror reflecting reality, but an active participant in shaping how reality is organized within experience. Not by changing external conditions directly, but by influencing how those conditions are interpreted, prioritized, and integrated. This is especially evident when we examine how attention selects information from the environment. At any given moment, there is far more information available than can be consciously processed. The nervous system must filter, prioritize, and organize input in order for coherent experience to emerge. This filtering is not random. It is guided by expectation, by emotional relevance, by past conditioning, by present state, and by subtle internal biases that often remain outside conscious awareness. What this means is that attention is not simply directed outward toward reality. It is shaped from within as well. And this shaping determines the boundaries of what is experienced as real in the moment. If attention is narrowed, reality feels limited. If attention is broadened, reality feels expansive. If attention is fragmented, experience feels unstable. If attention is coherent, experience feels integrated. These shifts can occur without any change in external circumstances. Only the organization of awareness changes. And yet the entire quality of experience transforms accordingly. This brings us to a deeper question about freedom. We often think of freedom as the ability to act without constraint. But there is another dimension of freedom that is less visible and perhaps more fundamental: the freedom to notice, the freedom to recognize patterns as they arise, the freedom to pause before automatic interpretation takes hold. This form of freedom does not eliminate conditioning, but it introduces awareness into conditioning, and awareness changes the way conditioning operates. A habitual reaction that is fully unconscious tends to repeat itself unchanged. A habitual reaction that is recognized begins to lose its automatic authority. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, through repetition of observation. In this sense, awareness acts as a stabilizing influence on change itself, not forcing transformation, but allowing transformation to occur with greater clarity. As this process unfolds, another layer of understanding becomes available. The recognition that identity is not a fixed structure, but a narrative system maintained through selective attention. We are not simply who we think we are. We are also what we repeatedly attend to, what we remember, what we emphasize, what we reinforce through interpretation. Identity is therefore not a single object, but an ongoing synthesis of perception, memory, and meaning. And because synthesis is continuous, identity is also continuously evolving, even when we do not consciously notice it. This raises an interesting implication. If identity is fluid, then self-understanding must also be fluid. There is no final definition of who I am that fully captures the totality of experience. There are only temporary configurations of understanding that reflect current states of awareness. And as awareness shifts, so does the sense of self. This can be disorienting if interpreted rigidly, but it can also be liberating if understood as natural, because it means that human experience is not confined to a single narrative. It is capable of revision, expansion, reinterpretation, and integration of new perspectives. This capacity for reinterpretation is closely linked to imagination. Imagination is often dismissed as fantasy, but it plays a crucial role in shaping how reality is experienced. Before something is expressed externally, it is often first explored internally as possibility. Before behavior changes, perception of possibility must shift. Before perception shifts, imagination often introduces alternative frameworks. In this way, imagination is not separate from reality. It is part of the process through which reality is explored internally before being enacted externally. And when imagination interacts with awareness, new configurations of experience become possible, not because external laws are altered, but because internal models evolve. This evolution can be subtle, a slight shift in expectation, a new way of interpreting an old situation, a moment of recognizing an alternative response where only one seemed possible before. These small shifts accumulate over time, and accumulation leads to transformation. Not sudden transformation, but gradual restructuring of experience. This gradual restructuring is often only recognized in hindsight. Looking back, a person may notice that their way of perceiving life has changed significantly, even though no single moment appeared dramatic at the time. This is because consciousness tends to evolve incrementally. Through repetition, through reflection, through interaction, through exposure to new information and new states of being. And as it evolves, the relationship between inner and outer experience becomes increasingly integrated. What once felt external and separate begins to feel relational. What once felt fixed begins to feel responsive. What once felt absolute begins to feel contextual. This does not diminish the reality of the external world. It enriches the understanding of how that world is experienced. Because experience is always a collaboration between what is present and how it is perceived. And perception is always shaped by the current state of awareness. At this point in the inquiry, it becomes increasingly clear that understanding consciousness is not about arriving at a final explanation. It is about refining sensitivity, becoming more aware of how experience is constructed in real time, noticing the subtle mechanisms through which meaning emerges, recognizing the patterns that shape interpretation, and observing how those patterns shift with attention. This kind of understanding is not purely intellectual. It is experiential. It requires direct engagement with the process of awareness itself. And as that engagement deepens, the boundary between understanding and experience begins to dissolve in subtle ways, revealing that what we are calling reality may be less of a fixed structure to be analyzed and more of an ongoing process to be witnessed, participated in, and gradually understood from within, even as it continues to unfold in ways that remain just beyond complete definition, because at the core of this unfolding there is still one remaining thread that continues to emerge whenever awareness turns back upon itself. And that is the recognition that awareness does not merely illuminate experience, but may also define the very boundaries within which experience becomes possible in the first place. This is where the inquiry becomes most subtle, because it is one thing to say that awareness interprets reality. It is something deeper to consider that awareness may also participate in the structuring of what is available to be interpreted, not in a simplistic cause and effect sense, but as a continuous shaping of perceptual availability itself. At this level, reality is not a fixed field waiting to be observed. It is a dynamic range of potential experiences that become accessible through the conditions of perception. And those conditions are not separate from consciousness. They are expressions of it. When I reflect on this, I notice how easily the mind defaults to thinking in terms of separation. A world out there and an observer in here, yet every attempt to locate the boundary between the two becomes increasingly uncertain under close examination. Where exactly does perception begin? Is it at the level of the senses? Is it in the neural processing of signals? Is it in the moment of awareness itself? Each answer points to another layer, and each layer reveals that the boundary is not a fixed line, but a gradient of interaction. Sensation flows into interpretation. Interpretation flows into meaning. Meaning flows into response. Response flows back into environment. And the cycle continues without a clearly identifiable point of separation. What emerges instead is continuity, a continuous field of interaction in which observer and observed are intertwined aspects of a single unfolding process. This continuity suggests that what we call reality may be less like a collection of objects and more like a field of relationships. Relationships between perception and stimulus, between attention and selection, between memory and interpretation, between emotion and evaluation, between expectation and experience. Each of these relationships influences the others in real time, and together they form the structure of lived experience. Within this structure, stability is not absolute. It is maintained through ongoing adjustment. The brain continuously updates its models. The body continuously responds to internal and external signals. The mind continuously reorganizes meaning based on new input. Nothing remains static, and yet experience feels coherent because these adjustments are integrated rapidly and seamlessly. This integration is one of the most remarkable features of consciousness. It allows constant change to be experienced as continuity. But it also means that what feels like a stable reality is actually a dynamic construction maintained moment by moment. This realization can initially feel destabilizing if misunderstood. But when approached with clarity, it reveals something profoundly important. If reality is constructed through continuous processes, then change is not an exception to stability. It is the mechanism through which stability exists. This reframes transformation entirely. Change is not disruption. It is participation in a living system of adaptation. And within that system, awareness plays a central role in determining how adaptation unfolds. Because awareness influences what is noticed. What is noticed influences what is reinforced. What is reinforced influences what becomes habitual. And what becomes habitual shapes future perception. This recursive loop suggests that consciousness is not separate from the patterns it experiences. It is embedded within them, and yet within this embedding, there is still the possibility of reflection. The ability to notice patterns as patterns. This is where a subtle but powerful form of freedom arises. Not freedom from experience, but freedom within experience. The capacity to recognize that a thought is a thought, that an emotion is an emotion, that a perception is a construction, and that none of these are fixed identities, but dynamic events within awareness. This recognition does not eliminate experience. It changes the relationship to experience. And that change in relationship is often the beginning of deeper transformation. Because once identification loosens, perception becomes more flexible. And flexibility allows new interpretations to emerge where only fixed ones existed before. This flexibility is also what allows learning to continue throughout life. Without it, experience would simply reinforce existing patterns without modification. With it, experience becomes a field of ongoing adaptation. Every moment contains the possibility of reinterpretation, not because reality is unstable, but because awareness is capable of multiple perspectives. This multiplicity is essential. It allows complexity to be navigated without reducing it to overly simplistic explanations. And it allows meaning to evolve as understanding deepens. As I continue to explore this, I am reminded that many of the most significant shifts in human understanding have not come from external discovery alone, but from changes in the way observation itself is understood. When observation is seen as passive, reality appears fixed. When observation is understood as participatory, reality appears dynamic. When observation is recognized as inseparable from awareness, reality appears relational. Each shift expands the scope of what can be considered possible, and each expansion reveals new layers of inquiry. This suggests that knowledge is not a final endpoint, but a continually evolving relationship between awareness and what is being known. A relationship that deepens through attention, reflection, and experience. And perhaps this is why certainty remains elusive even in the presence of increasing knowledge. Because knowledge does not eliminate complexity, it reveals it. The more we understand, the more interconnected the system appears. The more we observe, the more layers emerge. The more we inquire, the more questions arise. This is not a limitation. It is a feature of an unfolding reality, one that appears to resist final closure because it is inherently dynamic. And within this dynamism, awareness remains the constant through which everything is experienced. Not as a fixed observer standing outside the process, but as the very field in which the process is known. This leads to a final, quietly profound recognition that every attempt to understand reality is simultaneously an exploration of awareness itself, and every exploration of awareness inevitably reveals new dimensions of reality. They are not two separate inquiries. They are a single unfolding investigation expressed from different angles. And as this understanding deepens, it becomes increasingly clear that what we are encountering is not a puzzle to be solved once and for all, but a living field of experience to be engaged with continuously, where each moment of attention opens another doorway into the vast and still unfolding mystery of what it means to be aware, because at the center of that unfolding there remains one final realization that cannot be fully captured in words, only directly encountered in the immediacy of experience itself. And that is
deep dive analysis, reality, consciousness, and the hidden architecture of experience. When we explore the idea that reality is more complex than we once believed, we are not just discussing science or philosophy in isolation. We are examining something far more intimate, the way human experience is constructed in every single moment of life. To understand this, we must begin with a simple but powerful idea. You are not directly experiencing reality. You are experiencing a version of reality that is constructed by your nervous system, shaped by your memory, and filtered through attention. That may sound abstract, but let's ground it in something familiar. 1. Perception is a construction, not a recording. Imagine you are watching a movie. You see colors, movement, sound, emotion. But in reality, what is on the screen is just light patterns. Your brain converts those patterns into meaning. This is exactly what happens in everyday life. Your eyes receive light, your ears receive vibrations, your skin receives pressure and temperature, But none of these are experienced yet. Your brain interprets them and builds a story. So when you see a tree, you are not seeing a tree directly. You are experiencing your brain's interpretation of light reflecting off an object. This is important because it means experience is not fixed. It is constructed in real time. And if something is constructed, it can be influenced too. Attention is the steering wheel of reality. Among all mental processes, attention is the most powerful. Why? Because it decides what gets amplified in your experience. Right now, you could focus on the feeling of your breath, the sound in your environment, or a thought in your mind. Whatever you choose becomes your reality in that moment. A simple example: if you focus on problems all day, life feels heavy. If you focus on opportunities, life feels open. The external world may not have changed, but your experience of it has completely shifted. This is not imagination, it is neuroscience. The brain filters millions of bits of information every second and only allows a small fraction into conscious awareness. So attention is not passive, it is creative. It shapes your inner world moment by moment. 3. Emotion shapes biology, not just mood. One of the most misunderstood aspects of human experience is emotion. Many people think emotions are just reactions, but in reality, emotions are biological signals that influence the entire body. For example, asterisk, chronic stress signals the body to stay in survival mode. Asterisk, calm states signal safety and restoration. Asterisk, gratitude and connection support balance in the nervous system. Think of your body like an intelligent system, constantly responding to emotional instructions. If you live in fear for long periods, your body adapts to that environment. If you live in calm awareness, your body adapts differently. This means emotional patterns are not just psychological, they are biological shaping forces. 4. Beliefs act like invisible filters. A belief is not just an idea in your mind. It is a filter that determines what you notice and how you interpret it. For example, if someone believes I always fail, their mind will automatically highlight evidence that supports failure. If someone believes I can learn, the same situation will be interpreted as feedback rather than defeat. The external world stays the same, but perception changes completely. This is why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different realities. Beliefs quietly shape attention, attention shapes perception, and perception shapes behavior. 5. The mind-body loop. You are a feedback system. One of the most important insights from modern science is that the mind and body are not separate systems. They constantly influence each other. A stressful thought changes heart rate. A calm breath changes emotional state. A memory can trigger physical sensations. This creates a loop: thought, emotion, body, response, new thought. Over time, this loop becomes your default state. But here is the key insight: if it is a loop, it can be interrupted. 6. Awareness creates the gap for change. Most human behavior runs automatically. We react before we realize we are reacting. But awareness introduces something powerful: a gap. In that gap, something new becomes possible. Instead of reacting instantly, you begin to notice, I am feeling anger. I am feeling fear. I am thinking this thought. That small shift changes everything. Because now you are no longer fully inside the pattern. You are observing it. And what you can observe, you can begin to change. 7. Reality feels stable, but it is always updating. One of the most surprising discoveries in neuroscience is that the brain is constantly predicting reality. It does not wait for information, it anticipates it. That means your experience of the present moment is actually a blend of asterisk past memory, asterisk present input, asterisk future expectation. This creates a stable feeling world, even though everything is constantly changing underneath. So what we call reality is more like a living prediction system than a fixed environment. 8. Practical ways to apply this in daily life. Here are simple ways to embody these insights. 1. Practice attention control. Spend a few minutes daily observing where your attention goes. Noticing alone reduces automatic patterns. 2. Pause before reacting. Even a 2-3 second pause before responding can shift your entire emotional trajectory. 3. Name your experience. Instead of I am stressed, try I am noticing stress. This creates psychological distance. 4. Track beliefs. When you feel stuck, ask, what must I believe for this to feel true? This reveals hidden assumptions. 5. Regulate your body first. Slow breathing or grounding the body often changes thinking more effectively than forcing thoughts. 9. The deeper meaning. At the deepest level, these ideas point toward a simple truth. You are not trapped inside reality, you are participating in it. Your experience is not a fixed outcome. It is a dynamic process shaped by attention, emotion, belief, and awareness. This does not mean everything is under conscious control. Life remains complex and unpredictable, but it does mean you are not powerless inside it. You are part of the system that creates experience itself. And as awareness becomes more refined, experience becomes less automatic and more conscious. Not because reality changes, but because your relationship with reality changes. Final reflection. The most important shift is not in what you see, but in how you see. Because when perception changes, everything that follows begins to reorganize itself. And that is where real transformation quietly begins.